Hello and welcome to episode 6 of Catalyzing Radical Systemic Change. The topic of today's episode is redefining money, value, and impact. And preparing the session, I think best is to start with a quote. The quote is from Abraham Lincoln, and it says, "The best way to predict the future is to create it." And my assumption is that much like Abraham Lincoln was living in crucial times, with the abolition of slavery ahead, we're living in a time where it is blatantly obvious that the way the current economic paradigm works can't function for that much longer. And instead of complaining about all the things that are going into the wrong direction, I feel very grateful to showcase today some very hands-on and concrete examples of how we can make sure that the way we rebuild money on what I would call the DNA level, and how we deploy capital for a meaningful regenerative future for the many generations ahead can be done. So without further ado, Katie, I would like to hand over to you and briefly just sketch who you are and maybe also give us a tiny first of a glimpse actually why you started Open Future Coalition.
Sure. Thanks, Alistair. As Alistair mentioned, I'm the founder and CEO of Open Future Coalition, and I'll start kind of sparked by that quote that you shared, by sharing that from a very young age, I always saw some dissonance in how we were organized as a society. The first persuasive essay that I wrote at, I think, 10 years old was on why the US bipartisan political system should be abolished. And I remember always thinking, well, if a meteor were headed towards the planet, you'd think we'd stop everything we were doing to do something to fix it. And yet I looked around and I just saw that everyone was kind of conducting business as usual. And I remember how dissonant that felt from a very young age. And that first kind of drew me towards an interest in public service and as a community organizer. And I ultimately came through that work to recognize the power of written and visual communications. And so really I began my career in public media, first branding and growing the reach of NPR and PBS programs. And then in 2013, I founded a design studio in New York called Incendiary. And we really came to focus on two things. One were some of the most complex multi-stakeholder rebrands in the impact space. And the other was kind of helping to make global advocacy tools more accessible. And through this work with, dozens, if not hundreds of organizations on most continents, kind of from grassroots to major NGOs and nonprofits, I really was able to see what was working well within that space in terms of resourcing and funding and what wasn't. And then I would kind of moonlight in venture studios, building out enterprise software and fintech. And through that effort, I found myself one day in this very different kind of product meeting and ended up leading the design of the first regulated institutional grade trading platform for digital assets. And through that work, I found myself interfacing directly with the regulators. And so I started to recognize that some of the regulatory and policy pieces, some of these levers that I thought I needed to be pulling from the grassroots weren't as insurmountable as they seemed. And so I've spent the intervening years really kind of weaving together those two worlds and looking at, well, how can we kind of start to leverage these tools of economic and policy design to help support those that are on the grassroots, on the front lines doing this work. And a quick glimpse into what we're up to with Open Future Coalition is really looking at how can we meet those who are doing where they are. I'll posit that, when a lot of us are looking around, waving our arms, saying, how are we possibly going to mobilize quickly enough to solve these global compounding crises? I would argue that so many of those solutions are already out there. They're just perpetually under-resourced. And so we've been looking on ways, I'll get into it in a bit, at how we can well resource these efforts with what they need, when they need it, so that they can more effectively scale.
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, I think before really embarking on that emergent dialogue, I would like to hand it over to Joshua.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here this evening. We might be quickly greeted by my daughter before she goes to bed. Good, she's brushing her teeth, great not. So I'll talk about myself. I was born in the US and grew up in the US, was raised by a single mom on welfare on the other side of the tracks. And so when I was able to get out of the catch-22 that was poverty and the intergenerational poverty that I grew up in, I had this profound feeling that I needed to contribute back into the world. And I found myself as an exchange student in Germany on a scholarship and living in Ecuador and studying again in many other parts of the world. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Morocco, finding like what was my one contribution that I would be able to make to really move the needle on making an impact. And it was through a career of working on development issues, international development issues, as a diplomat in the Obama administration, where I found myself managing a very large social impact portfolio, looking at how can we take these large sums of money and get them to people and those organizations that need it the best, but not programmed necessarily from our perch high on the mountain, but really refocusing the power dynamics and the balance so that those who are the ultimate beneficiaries of these funds were able to take part in co-creating this. And this idea of kind of rebalancing power, getting capital to those who need it, was always something that was important for me, whether I was working in software development or running and building social enterprise incubators in Southeast Asia, for example. And so that's kind of my life's work now, is looking at really the human element in all of this, because so often we forget about how we are as how we show up, how our journeys that we've been through, how vulnerable we're able to be, and use that vulnerability as a driving force. Same thing with how our organizations, their healths, are oftentimes forgotten, whether it be in grant making or in venture capital, and it's not really used as a stepping stone to allow us to create more value in the work that we are doing. So we'll talk about Masawa, the organization that I work with and founded in a bit as well.
Thanks, Joshua. Indy, may you please intro yourself?
Yes. So my name's Indy Johar. I suppose my journey has been, I trained as an architect. Got very quickly frustrated that architecture was largely reproducing old thoughts, stylistically kind of wrapped. Ended up working in urban policy and working with organizations like Demos in the UK, and then ended up really starting to realize that the only way I could contribute was to be more entrepreneurial. So I ended up building stuff like Bristol Urban Beach with Melissa Mean, which was, we lost £35,000 building an urban beach, which is kind of fun, where we made a profit share agreement. Never, ever, ever make profit share agreements with bars. Always make revenue share agreements, just as a kind of simple rule. There is never any profit, but there's definitely loads of revenue. So all the way through to kind of ended up working with people like Jonathan Robinson to build the Impact Hub network, and did since about 2004. Did a lot of that, and then wrote the Compendium for the Civic Economy, and then off the back of that ended up building several impact hubs through social investment structures and Open Desk, open source furniture company, and WikiHouse, which is open source housing. So I ended up building lots of stuff, and then about 2015 realized that most of what we were building were kind of were built on the implied order of, the problem is not housing, the problem is land. The kind of illusion is housing, and we make smaller and smaller housing, and we sort of invite architects to make really, really small housing because that'll solve the problem. But actually, it's much more structural about kind of our theories of land and our theory of how we own and ownership and other models. And all the way through, we'd been experimenting with a lot of organizational forms, realizing that most of organizational forms were constructed on the theory of management, and management was an extension of kind of kingship. It was the kind of theory of control. So how do you rebuild organization? It was very clear to me that in order to build new things in the world, you had to build the way you organize. Unless you did the two together, actually you'd always fall back to the kind of reality of control. And kind of small caricature for that, and I'll wrap up. I worked 5 years in an architectural practice, and what was very clear was then we went from being about 11 people to about 70 people. When we were 11 people, we built handrails. We designed handrails with nodules on them because tactile memory is one of the last memories to go. When we were 70, we were effectively designing colorful facades. So, and that was all a function of the theory of control. What could you control in proximity? And what would you control when you were 70? So if you want to actually be able to scale complex capabilities, I think you have to change the nature of the organizations that you build, and thereby also change the effects. So that's really been since 2015, been building, actually looking at some of the institutional infrastructures that sit behind the world that we make, that create the implied order of the world that we see around us, and building that. That's it.
I'm so curious how Katie would tie into what Indy was just saying, both from the way you want to organize Open Future Coalition, as well as build a different structure that then can truly, radically prototype, experiment new ways to deploy capital for projects with Open Future Coalition. And I'm just curious how you tie that into what Indy was just saying.
I'd love to. So I'd say the main way that we're addressing that is through figuring out how to not compromise fidelity at scale. To zoom out a little bit on what I mean by that kind of systemically is I would argue that, we're all driven by story. Money is a story. And then I tend to say that one of the issues that we're currently find ourselves facing, not only in our financial system, but in our social system, is that we've supported for too long the system of runaway scaling. We've essentially managed to scale words, we've managed to scale messaging, and we haven't necessarily effectively scaled communication or meaning. And I believe that that's the case in our scaling of our projects and the scaling of kind of the abstraction of our financial instruments. And so part of the pattern that we're looking to enable is how can you actually return that context? How can we make our modes of exchange more contextual? And more particularly, when we look at how we can scale these on-the-ground efforts that I alluded to earlier, we're really looking at if we can fully capture with greater transparency these modes of community commerce and of trust. And you can templatize that. For example, if we have a civic infrastructure project like those that Indy mentioned, right now, if I build one building using a set of criteria, I have a set of standard operating procedures, I know what I'm measuring, maybe there's particular training or guidelines around that. And then I go and scale that 2,000 times in 2,000 different cities. That might not be a responsible thing to do. And so one very specific thing that we've been looking to address is, well, wait a second, I think that there's a way to scale something without compromising that fidelity. Because if we were to take that template and then package that into a template that is distributed, and then you have folks in all of these different municipalities that are adopting that template, and they're able to take that off the shelf, but rather than being in their silos, they're actually capable of being in communities of practice with others that are also leveraging that same template. Then we have this possibility to benefit from one another's learnings and from one another's mistakes, such that we're able to effectively continue to advance that template, that sort of approach over time in a way where we also have the nuance of that information of exactly kind of whose dollars, what hours are going into what efforts in service of kind of what measurable impact, where those agreed upon standards can also kind of evolve forward in this more distributed fashion. So I'm going to pull myself out right now before I get further into the weeds. But that's one way that we've been looking at scaling as just a model for distributed learning forward and kind of preservation of fidelity.
Let's stay just for a moment more to be able to give the broader context for our audience. One thing that truly fascinates me about Open Future Coalition is to break up the silos. I mean, this is mentioned since I don't know how many decades, but the problem is actually how can we provide an environment where truly people work together on projects and provide an environment for learning. So that's one piece, that's the learning piece. And the other one that I find really interesting is how can we break up the barriers in between quote unquote classical philanthropy, classical nonprofit organizations, and the various, let's say, for-profit impact investing space. And I would like you to just mention some points.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll just speak a little bit to our timeline and how we're tackling each of these layers of this, complex multi-sided ecosystem, as you mentioned. So first, our aim is really to serve those who are doing so that they can do more effectively. Our core initial aim has really been how can we meet people where they are, whether they are an extremely grassroots effort or whether it's a complex multi-stakeholder or multi-agency collaboration. We see really similar kind of barriers there. And the first that we see is really for effective collaboration and project management. Whether you're a mightily small organization that simply doesn't have access to those tools, such as a simple CRM, or whether you're one of these more complex collaborations, we are seeing these kind of silos, as you mentioned. And so our first aim in unblocking these silos is through kind of providing access to fairly straightforward kind of collaborative and project management tools. But then what we've been layering in with that are two additional components. The second is facilitating sectoral and cross-sectoral collaborations. An example, we recently launched our platform with 25 different organizations globally, and we curated these by sector. And we're facilitating sectoral collaborations. And so we've put together learning groups in areas like water and regenerative agriculture and community wellness. But we're also facilitating cross-sectoral weaving. We have a skills and knowledge-based marketplace where folks can find one another and kind of match and sort of skills and best practice share across these silos so that over time, if you're, again, kind of benefiting from one another's skills or learnings, our thinking is that you become kind of less reliant on this external capital over time. And then the last piece is we see a lot of time being taken up by kind of this bifurcation between the act of doing and the act of measuring. Think about how much time is spent in reporting or in grant writing in the philanthropy space in particular. And so what we've been doing is in stride of providing these project management tools, if we have that measure of, again, whose dollars, what hours have gone into what efforts in service of what units of kind of community verified measurable impact, then at any given time, we have a just-in-time view of kind of what resources can or should be applied where to kind of garner the greatest forward-looking impact. And so that's where we've started, is really that kind of capacity building within the impact space and providing that greater measurement. And then to quickly allude to those two other horizons you mentioned, Alistair, next on the philanthropy front, what we've been looking at is we see philanthropies that are, of course, supporting along kind of a shared funding mandate theory of change. They're often supporting organizations that have similar aims, but those organizations aren't necessarily working with one another. And so we've been really looking at how can we unsilo philanthropy so that these organizations are working together rather than oftentimes, again, funding different organizations to have similar learnings, even to pay the same consultant, 10 times in parallel. How can we start to combine and kind of create greater co-learning and transparency so that as each dollar kind of enters that system, we're able to do so with greater equity and transparency. And then the third horizon that you alluded to is that we think that the binary between philanthropy and impact investment is a false one. They're both investment. They just have different returns. And in more particularly, we recognize that the cost of solving these complex crises that we've alluded to, such as climate crisis alone, that cost is expected to far exceed our total global philanthropic budget. Some projections saying triple our total global philanthropic budget year over year for the next decade. And so on the other side of that, we see these pension funds and family offices that have this social pressure to align their investments with impact. We see this sort of crazed in the direction of ESG, which frankly oftentimes results in more greenwashing. But in short, we see these investors who are expressing this desire to invest in impact, and oftentimes their pain point is they're saying, well, I just can't find enough high quality impact to invest in. And so in short, what we're looking to do is, if we, again, going back to this project management piece, if we're already have those measurements from the beginning, from the generation of that impact, of again, what auditable efforts went in service of what units of verified impact, that's precisely the ledger that's required to support the emergence of not only kind of new ecosystem services that are emerging beyond the carbon credit, we're looking at water credits and so forth, but also these new forms of kind of green bonds, social bonds, and other financial products that are wanting to emerge.
Hallelujah. Thanks, Katie. I consciously want to hand over to Joshua, because I know he will bring again a different perspective, a different lens on how to look at capital deployed.
Sure. So I gave a bit of a background of kind of where I've been and what I've seen and the trouble I've been able to cause, good trouble. And so now what we're working on, have been working on for the last number of years, is setting up the first mental wellness impact fund, one that doesn't just deploy capital, it nurtures capital. So I think a lot of the existential issues that we have as a society have to do with the fact that we're humans, because we're not good at listening or allowing Mother Nature to help guide us on what we actively should be doing, because we have the technology of a god currently, but we have the evolution that isn't actually so progressed as human species. And if you look at a lot of the climate change, for example, one major reason is because of our human needs that we're not able to fulfill at some fundamental level. The need to feel safe and belong, and we are able to cover that up by consuming or traveling too much, or not being connected with each other as a species, or with other species on this planet, or with Earth herself. And we see oftentimes that it's that lack of human factor that is completely ignored, because soft skills are hard to measure, but we know that if we're really going to change the nature of capital, and in our case, getting capital to those startup founders specifically who are able to catalyze mental wellness as fast as possible, so that we don't have depression being the number one cause of disability worldwide, increasing loneliness, dementia, substance abuse issues, et cetera, not only because and in part due to COVID, but which also these issues existed well before COVID. We're not going to be able to really attack these issues together as humanity. And so through a nurture capital approach, we look at weaving the people side of the equation, the individuals in the organization, the organizational culture, alongside the purpose. We've talked a lot, we've already, impact is a big word that we're using on this chat specifically. And more people are getting excited, especially in traditional financial system, socioeconomic systems. They want to see more impact and more purpose. But really being able to Katie's point, having measurable and accountable aspects that are woven very closely with the human elements is something that we feel will drive actually the profit. It's not even about driving profit in the traditional sense, but it's about increasing the ability for sustainability and eventually regeneration to take place. And so this nurture capital approach that we've designed, a framework, isn't rocket science. It just isn't really happening in at least the traditional financial world very much. Really looks at how helping other funds, family offices, institutional investors, accelerators, already from the very beginning, increase our ability to maximize social impact, founder well-being, and organizational health. And it doesn't just have to be those startups like in our fund, which are focused on mental wellness. I think it's applicable and more a humane and compassionate way of driving and utilizing capital for both extended social and financial returns.
Thanks both Joshua and Katie for that first layer of information to make it possible to grasp what you are working on. Indy, I'm curious where you would riff off either one of the two organizations mentioned, or maybe even both.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, no, I obviously agree with everything that's been said, and I suppose the way we've been looking at it, having gone through 2 cycles, is several things. I suppose I'm going to just run our hypothesis through, just in a kind of really cold way. This is what happened. So we came to the conclusion that impact investment didn't work for 2 reasons. One, the funds were too small. 20 million, 30 million portfolio size is just not sizable enough. And 2, which is perhaps even more fundamental, actually impact organizations create spillovers of value which are currently unvalued in the system. And externalities that are generated by existing products are unpriced in the system. So it's a double whammy. The positive aren't priced in the system, and the externalities for your benchmark aren't priced in the system. And a good example of that is, we've done the work on the High Line, for example, the High Line in New York. If you looked at the spillover value of the High Line in New York, you would have paid for the whole High Line in 10 months. Have you just got 10% of the land value uplift attributable to the High Line? Just 10%. So 90% was privatized, just 10%. So what that meant for us was that actually there was a 2-edged problem. One, the capital structures were too small, and 2, the positive spillover weren't captured. And then on the other side, if you look at the S&P 100, I think the stats are that if they had to price social environmental costs in, 78% of the S&P 100 is no longer viable. So actually our product domain that exists around us is all bullshit. It doesn't exist. It's actually just when people talk about a degrowing, we are currently in degrowth. Every product that you see is a degrowth product. It effectively is generating vast amounts of externalities already in excess of the positive effects that it generates. So there's a real question on that. Now, what that led us to believe is that when you take that problem, and then the third thing was actually, if you wanted to look at that, social value was largely constructed through spillover effects. So, for example, I spent 5 years working in India and working with some really brilliant people in India. That were doing total village investment. What was fascinating about that was that they did not take a product-centric view. They did not take a sort of sector-centric view. They were looking at the effects of irrigation on sanitation, on health, on education, to livelihoods, to access to markets. So they took a system-centric view of that investment portfolio. And that system-centric view was actually a completely different profile of investment models. Now, in order to manifest some of this stuff, we then decided, okay, if we want to start to think about this, we need to start to think about, firstly, a scale of investment that works. And we didn't think ventures were where you would go. We said infrastructure is where you go. So infrastructure is a really good class of investment because it can absorb hundreds of millions. So the quantum of capital structuring is right. Secondly, actually, it's a product which can create vast spillover effects if you design infrastructure in the right way. And then, so that was kind of a conceptual frame. I'm just doing it in a really, this took a long time and lots of failures. Nothing smooth about this at all. Retrospectively, looks way smoother. Then we identified over time was that trees, for example, urban canopies, if you reframe them as infrastructure, they are currently priced as liabilities. And there was huge amounts of positive spillover values, cooling effects, sustainable urban drainage, air pollution, and various other things, effects. If you looked at trees in an urban context as a piece of infrastructure, you could flip the whole model because there's hidden value which is unpriced in the system, and that dealt with the pricing of that model. So then what we've been looking at is landscape level financing solutions. So trees is one, the other one is whole city retrofit, another one is mental health, collective mental health of a city. So how do you value the collective mental health of a city? And all of these assets are fundamentally different types of infrastructure. So one is novel infrastructures like trees, nature. Another one is entangled benefits of whole city retrofit. And then, and this is, sorry about the tongue twistiness, but the collective mental health for us is an intangible, emergent asset. It's an emergent asset because it's a function of other pieces of investment which allow this asset to emerge in society, but it has massive societal value attributions. So we've then so that was kind of underlying asset class, and that allowed us to then start to think about new classes of instruments that could finance that story, and then new practices of governance, because the architecture of these infrastructures is such that they rely on multiple inputs and multiple outcomes, that your theory of governance can no longer be done through a public-private model. It has to be a many-to-many governance model. So that's kind of we've been re-engineering our theory of governance and almost trying to see these infrastructures as citizens. So it's a kind of a sort of, in a way, as we've seen the rise of self-sovereign rivers or self-owning rivers, we've been starting to think of these infrastructures as kind of these new self-sovereign entities that allows us to have many-to-many engagements and actually not bias towards one actor or another actor and value steal in that way. And that's really been a slightly boring journey. And obviously, at a landscape level, when you start to look at this, there's a whole next generation complexity where you start to look at what are the liabilities, the pooling of liabilities in a landscape, and then looking at asset matching against those pools of liabilities. So you do, so asset liability matching at a landscape level, which I think creates a new class of social or impact investing at that infrastructure scale. And that's really been some of the work. And all of this stuff is really only possible if you fundamentally adopt a digitally integrated approach. So you can't do most of this stuff unless you have spatial finance mechanisms in terms of being able to see what's going on, using geospatial tagging, using citizen science, as well as kind of Internet of Sensors type frameworks, because you have to be able to model the additionalities and those frameworks around this stuff in integrated ways and be able to verify the models in those ways. So I think, and that all the way goes to contracting infrastructures and financing mechanisms, which I could boringly get into, but want to avoid that. But I think that's where we've been, and that's the journey we've taken, I suppose, to get here. And nothing smooth about it at all. Lots and lots and lots of mistakes.
If I had a talking stick, I would literally put it into the middle of the four of us and really maybe consciously pause, even if it's just for half a minute, and then sense where the background you're coming from and what you're working on might evolve into an impulse. Because I now have the feeling we have kind of the infrastructure layer, the mental health layer. We have three different horizons. And I'm really curious because a journey of 1,000 miles starts always with the first step, and then the next step, and then the next step of how you, respectively, in your organization and with your project, want to weave the complexity needed ahead into tangible steps. So that's it. That was too long of a pause for Alistair, right? I'm super curious, Joshua, on what you are building and on the bigger piece of intangible infrastructure.
Sure. I think if you look at really not ignoring or pricing in to the extent that you can the human factor, and for us we define that as individuals' ability or the human's ability to flourish inside of the organization or group, what they're spending most of their time on, and then also humans' ability to flourish because of the organization, because of the products, services, approaches, and factoring those two in terms of pricing in as a mechanism for evaluating whether it be the infrastructure, whether it be the both landscape, building, urban space design, political systems, products and services, things that we probably spend way too much money or my children want me to buy and I acquiesce. These are the things that are coming up for me in terms of being able to price in the effect of what we're talking about a little bit on the human elements, both inside and outside the human factor. Which is something we're emerging in our discussions, especially on the backs of ESG, which is now becoming all the rage, a great thing, and also troublesome at the same time. Being able to put across that human lens, that human factor lens, and saying, well, actually, this is a different way. Now, what and this is I'm being very honest and transparent, is having troubles with is figuring out that those mechanisms for accounting for that internal, which I think we have pretty much understood, human factor, and then the external human factor. But I think taking this into account for everything that we're working on the various projects, it's been quite surprising for us just in the last number of months, the number of funds and impact-related organizations and accelerators who know that they need to differentiate their products and services in this old traditional system by bringing in well-being, organizational health, purpose, tying all of those things together. That there is a movement here, and it's not that it's us versus them. It's that we have the ability to just start doing this, start acting upon this to show the power that it can have.
Katie, your thoughts?
A lot of wheels turning here. Let's see. I'm gonna try to weave kind of what Indy and Joshua just shared. So one thing that's coming up for me here is kind of our role as a bridge between these horizons, and kind of how do we design for the wholeness that's required, because if we overly orient to the current necessity when we're trying to design for that third horizon, then we're going to necessarily sub-optimize, right? And so one piece that comes up a lot for me, and that I know Indy speaks to this often, is how do we, and we've been talking a little bit around unpriced assets here, so I'm going to put into the center this concept of how do we price the value of failure? Because I think we too often don't provide the space to fund our mistakes, and sometimes our mistakes are the most valuable. So that's one piece that I'm curious about how that'll best enter the conversation. But then a little bit more tactically, as we look at kind of this transition between right now, how do we kind of start to fund and support things in the right direction that can maybe meet the needs of current stakeholders as we're then designing for this third horizon, which I imagine will be a lot more self-governed, a lot more distributed. Some of the very practical instruments that we've been exploring is, I think that towards the beginning, yes, we might be using far more practical means where we start to measure and capture some of these unpriced assets, and maybe we, create secondary markets for digital securities, and there's already, compliant ways to do that. But then where we're headed, I'm going to quickly allude to what we've been conceptualizing in terms of creating value that's based on what we really value as people and planet, and try to weave in some of this social component. So I've been kind of seeing two mediums of exchange as required for the emergence of this new paradigm. One is a kind of a new form of community commerce. And I think that'll look like something that is diversified and sovereign, where you can kind of, be, maybe it'll resemble kind of, metric currencies, right? It's minted on the fly. It's high velocity. It might discourage hoarding, all these different mechanics. And then on the other side of that is the interactivity of this more metric commerce with an impact-based commerce. And one piece I'm really curious, particularly having Joshua in this conversation for, is the balance between the quantitative and the qualitative that I think we have a responsibility to hold in how we measure that impact-based commerce. And so as we bring it back to some very practical applications like project management and measurement, I think we need to be really careful not to fall back into these easy kind of activity-based measurement paradigms where, a global NGO swoops in and says, I did, therefore I was useful, and here's the measurement of my output. And instead kind of turning this onus back on members of the community. And I think one way in which we can do that is creating a third layer. So I mentioned community commerce, the sort of impact-based commerce, so the measurement of these outcomes. And then I think there's this third kind of social validation layer that can act as a multiplier across those two, that is a necessary bridge. And one way we've been exploring that is, again, rather than having that NGO swoop in and say, I did, therefore I was useful. Let's say you were serving meals. Okay, well, let's start to survey community members so that they can reflect that back and say, I received and it was useful to me, and this was my experience. And so we can start to bring in community engagement directly in this act of impact validation. Another example, if we're doing something that's perhaps a little bit more, scientifically focused, let's say we're working on agroforestry projects, right? And someone's planted X number of trees. Well, we won't include that on the ledger until a community member who's been trained in tree planting verification has gone through and verified that those trees have been planted. There are a number of ways we can achieve that. But what I'm really interested in is this sort of orthogonal vector of kind of community verification and participation within the emergence of this new form of commerce. And I think that there are a lot of ways that we can then kind of orchestrate in stride of kind of going along this bridge, kind of local new forms of kind of resilience for community members and kind of upskilling and participation through citizen science, through project-based learning, in a way that will have incredible social multipliers that then will have then the capacity to start to capture and roll into the emergence of this commerce.
Everybody feel free to unmute. I really want to allow more of the flow of the conversation.
And quickly to your point about quantification versus qualification is crucial, and we're not using the traditional logical frameworks that have been used especially, for example, you're speaking a lot about the development sector, international development, where an external entity comes in and does X, upskills a group of people and gets something for it. But flipping that paradigm so that the outcomes, the activities, the inputs are also really co-created and owned, and agency is a key currency in this. Not currency we were talking about, in terms of individuals having the agency that they need to and want to, because I was a Peace Corps volunteer for 2 years in Morocco. I was 23, I had no idea what I was doing. I drank a lot of tea and I made a lot of jokes, and I couldn't have ever provided anything to these people coming from the United States, and really learned firsthand that they have everything, that they need, and they're also probably on average a lot happier than most people in the West because of a number of different dynamics. Something I also hope we're able to do soon is really understand the secondary and tertiary effects of the investments that we're doing. If we're providing meals, or if an organization is providing meals, not only how many bellies are filled, but how many children the next day are able to go to school, how many, if that persists, what is the overall change in overall human wellness and people's ability to thrive because of not just a one interaction, because it's not about being able to trace it back to that one instance, but the whole cornucopia of interactions that can contribute on a kind of matrix 3x3x3 or n by n by n scheme.
So let me be the person with the hand grenade then. Does any of this actually take us home? Like,
what is home?
Actually, well, I would say that if you talk about radical systems change, which was kind of the title, I don't think we're anywhere close. I think, I suppose in a way, I suppose I've just been sitting here going, if I was the audience and Alistair told me we're going to be talking about radical systems change, I'm not sure this is radical system change. And I'm not sure this gets us anywhere close because, like I sort of said, I think if you look at climate change effects, if you look at any of the big things, we're nowhere close. We're nowhere close. We can best be, we might plant some trees, we might cover a couple of cities, we might do some of this change, but actually we're nowhere close if you look at the scale of what we're facing. So, I mean, I suppose, how do we change every organization to have the high quality mental health context that it needs to have? And is that a function of mental health, or is it a function of really fundamentally going past the theory of CEO management models? Actually, it's about changing, I don't know, the pay differentials in how we pay, all of that stuff, right? So at DM, for example, our pay structure is based not on paying people for the work they do, but trying to pay people trying to pay people so they're free to do the work they want to do. The pay differential is 2 to 1 between the highest paid employee and the lowest paid employee. So I don't know. I suppose if we're going to, we know that real estate, so most organizations are optimizing towards real estate. So that's what they do. They the numbers are how efficiently are people packed into their buildings. We know that was a rubbish number and COVID killed it nicely. We know that actually real estate is about 10% of the cost of an organization, whereas people are about 60 to 65% of the value of an organization. Yet we massively underinvest in them. We know people are actually not assets. Every CEO stands up and says, people are the assets. They're not, they're liabilities. They sit on the liability side of the balance sheet. We don't have a framework to be able to invest in people. Every investment in human beings is a sunk cost. There's no additionality to the balance sheet. I don't know. I suppose I'm just picking up the mantle of Alistair here, going, yeah, come on, man. What does this really all mean?
Thanks, Indy. So I'm dialing in from Mexico. So I love the spices you put into the masala here. The way that why I did invite the three of you is my gut feeling is the more complex a system, the less we can predict a tipping point in both directions. And I think certainly all of us are committed to making a difference, right? Most of the audience as well. Sure. And I think what is needed now is that we build prototypes and experiments that compromise the least possible to prototype, I would say, something that still is emergent, but that has the innocence, the beauty, the richness, the honesty, the transparency. I would say these are all values that I would call are baked into, I would use the word sacredness of an architecture where truly, if not all, then the vast majority of all stakeholders in the ecosystem benefit. Truly, much like in a garden or in a natural system. So I don't want to overly stretch the metaphor from the garden, because I think it's a retro-romantic metaphor, because we won't get rid of technology. Even more so, we need to amalgamate the already existing and emergent technology to mimic, I think, entanglement, reciprocity, reciprocity, and the collective wisdom and intelligence that is usually just inherent in the mycelium, such as, for example, in different parts of the garden. So anyhow, to hand it over as a question, I know I'm not so good at asking precise questions over, but what do you do, Joshua? What do you do, Katie? What do you do, Indy, to make sure you try to compromise the least possible, given the framework that sometimes we need to compromise on in the given context that we're working?
Yeah. I feel like I'm deeply grateful for that, Alistair, also for the grenade that Indy threw. Because all that we're doing are testing a series of hypotheses. And my hope is that with this hypothesis that we're specifically working on, that the ripple effect and that the knock-on effects are so great that you can no longer ignore, for example, the human factor in our specific case, because you're going to lose out on a shit ton of money, and that's unfortunately what is still driving people and still will be for some time, unfortunately. And I think that, Indy, your discussions at the beginning, where you were failing a whole bunch, you were validating your hypotheses, or you were invalidating your hypotheses, and then you would move into the next thing. And I don't know where that tipping point is, where that fulcrum is, to be able to drive things. And I figure once they do happen, it will be stumbled upon, not out of luck, out of serendipity, out of having tried a number of things. Lots of different groups of people coming together and going apart and coming together and doing things on all the dimensions of the world. But I guess for me, it's not. I don't have this yearning that we have to fucking change everything because it's all broken. We just have to change enough. And that end just has to be. I don't know what that number is, to be able to get things over the line.
I mean, I suppose the reason why I sort of threw in the grenade is I'm often in a space where I'm questioning, like, where is it? And I'm not in any way saying whether I put DM in the same spot, right? I put all the work that we do in the same spot. Is it enough? Is it right? Is it the right position? And the reason why I ask that question is, and I suppose, I really want to sort of go back to radical systems change. If you want to talk about radical systems change, we have to transform our theory of how much a human is valued. Right. So the reality is, I can't remember the exact number, but I think a human by insurance companies is valued at something between about £20,000 to £30,000. That sort of figure. That's the price of a life. And why I say that is that actually, if you look at it from a different point of view, from a kind of Toby Ord sort of existential risk and existential hope point of view, you'd say that every one of us is a king and a queen of 13.8 billion years of evolution to get to every one of us. It took that many options and iterations to get to every one of us. And then if you look at the near infinite options that every one of us creates into the future, you would say that, Joshua, the kind of infinite options that you will create into the future could mean that your descendants were the pivotal thing that transformed our relationship in the universe. It's optionally very plausible, right? What that means is that every human is relatively infinite value, if you look at it through a future sense point. And why I bring that case is that I think I would argue that we are trapped in a paradigm which actually misunderstands value at a structural level. and has a kind of misunderstanding of us as well in that structural level. And I think radical system change requires us to go that deep, to go away from a theory of object orientation to entanglement orientation, to go away from the theory of control to learning orientation, to move from an idea of individualism to space-time kind of planetary engagement, the value of human being near infinite as opposed to being near negligible. And when you move any of these shifts, they change everything around us. They change the value of everything. They change the engagement that we have with each other. We talk to each other in a different way. We behave with each other a different way. Our relationship of contract is not that of extraction, but of care. So it changes. It's a leap of conception that transforms everything. And I suppose when I sort of, as I entered into this conversation, I think that was where my mind space went. That if we were going to, well, from my perspective, if we wanted to respect this idea of the radical systems change, then the radicality lies in some deep codes. And those deep codes are manifesting, right? The reason why humans are a liability on the balance sheet is because we see them as an overhead, as opposed to actually sort of somebody which is investable, or in any way, it's just a cost overhead. And that manifests in everything because we're constantly in a relationship where the return on capital is now much higher than the return on labor. So we're seeing we're in the Engels pause period where return on labor is flatlined and return on capital is accelerating. And that divergence is manifesting in inequality for the wealthy in a really structural sense. So I suppose I kind of sat here and just like, and that manifests in everything, right? For me, this is, can you price the environmental services of a tree? Should you? Okay, should we be pricing? Should there be gift economies? Should there be thought through in a fundamentally different way? I don't know. That's where my mind was going, kind of patiently in the background of going, all right, then, let's take your challenge, Alistair.
Yeah, I'm going to bring us a little bit further into the mystery, kind of building off of that. If we kind of further bend that arc of scale a little bit, I think we're really pointing to untangling this false belief that as we scale exponentially, we lose intimacy. And I'm going to argue that being radical is actually extremely intimate. And as we think about the design principles that are required and the types of prototypes that we're each working on, that question of, are we building a world or are we building an atom? I think it's the same thing. I think that even the smallest prototype that we build must contain at least a whisper of the wholeness of what needs to emerge, or else we are compromising, or else we're kind of replicating that unwholeness that we're looking to revolutionize kind of past. And so this isn't necessarily an answer, more of a continuation of your question, but I'd push that, when we ask this question of scale, are we building a prototype? Are we revolutionizing society? I think every prototype is an entire society, that they're the same thing.
I feel like just because at times and again in our conversation encounter a very complex language. I will give an example of a founder of a company in Berlin that I know that might be watching or might be listening consecutively. And she very consciously is employing single mothers. So the vast majority of the people who are working for her are half-time single mothers, so meaning mothers that need to care about one or multiple children and don't even can share part-time the children with, let's say, another partner. This fragment of society is like highly vulnerable, but like the founder, a woman herself who found herself in the same situation with 2 children and who set up a company, really basically wanted to showcase that it is possible that you can run a company in the given surrounding by following that model. And I met her, I think, it's not 24 years or something like that. It's not a newly founded company. And it was I just wanted to showcase that example, that I think it's a pretty radical example, not as radical as in the abstract sense as you, Indy, were throwing the hand grenade. But what I wanted to say is that I think in each generation, we have our challenges, and we need to bake into, I don't know why I used that word suddenly, into the sacredness, because I really think there's a universal structure that means that actually the possibility of regenerative business models is already out there. Yes, we need to reinvent it and bake it into the institutional infrastructure and deploy the capital in ways that it can work for the future generations. But I truly think it's already there. And I really just wanted to throw that piece of information into the middle. That, yeah, maybe you, Joshua, I don't know, maybe also you. Actually, I would find it interesting. Maybe how would you nurture the capital in some of the startups? I don't know if you're allowed to mention some of the examples. And how...
So I missed the second phrase of that. I don't know if others missed that too, but I can probably infer of what you were asking. Thank you for bringing a very concrete example of someone who's bucking the trends and having their passion and vision around creating solutions also for someone in their own similar situation. I think looking at that time horizon of 1 and 2, when we're looking at transforming or working within the existing capital system, how we nurture the capital is really co-creating with founders and organizations what they feel that needs to happen with their, in terms of their journeys of being able to be both held accountable to the purpose, to the impact that they're wanting to drive, and to the human elements of the organizations that they're running. And so it's a series nurture capital plan that is a number of different modalities, but it's every interaction is bespoke. Every engagement is bespoke because it has to be. There's not a one size fits all methodology. And it's taking from a lot of the learnings of the team. We've spent most of our careers working in emerging markets in various types of organizations, and really taking that learning that we're just here to accompany others. And oftentimes be a voice, oftentimes be the ones on the front saying, no, we can't actually put a premium on the people of the organization, the purpose of the organization in order to get to the sustainable or profitability. No, we actually want to be seated with other traditional investors, whether they be impact or not, and be asking about the human factor in these contexts. Or being ones to say, no, it's actually okay if we invest or would like to invest in various forms of organizations, regardless of if it's a nonprofit, a for-profit, steward-owned or not. It's about getting capital to really drive impact forward. That specific question.
So I'll step in for Alistair. Joshua,
channel him. Can you channel him?
Exactly. I'll channel him. But I really can't. Actually, it's too good. But I suppose you're deploying capital, right, into organizations. How have you changed the kind of model of capital allocation, in a sense, to build a different theory of portfolio? Have you found that by investing in organizations which are human first, actually you get a different type of portfolio, i.e. your portfolio is more resilient, your default rates are lower, you're looking for higher learning functions, you're not looking for 100x's, but you're looking for 10x's. So I'm just kind of curious if you could 2x. So 2x is across a wider. So if you get to 2x, you have to get 50% of your portfolio to give back. So you've got to be at 60 to 70% of your portfolio should be retained. So your heroin component, as I tend to call venture capital, more heroin capital. So it has an accelerated growth. Have you structured the fund so it's 20-year returns
Right.
So is it 2020 cycle? What, like, just to get into some of the details would be really great.
Sure, certainly. So it's we're very, as an emerging fund, we're still in the very early stages of both making our first investments and finishing also the fundraising process. But the idea is that it's a typical 10+2 model, and 10 years of investing for 2 years return. And because the focus of the fund is on founders who are working to catalyze mental wellness, those are ones that are more receptive to doing the inner journeys that they need, and building the resilient organizations and focusing more on the culture. The intended return is 2x. We think it'll be much higher because of the specific aspects that you mentioned, lower default rates, mediocre organizations being able to perform better because they can simply talk to each other and get over their own human elements that prevent a lot of, or that cause a lot of the breakdowns in startups. And so that's, but again, this is the hypothesis. The entire first fund is looking at this hypothesis of, does nurturing capital actually lead to these higher returns? And then, as I mentioned, and kind of out of a bit unexpectedly, other funders becoming interested also in this human element, and now we're starting to deploy our services to those as well. Yeah.
And the other thing, I suppose, I mean, not one to admire massively, but significantly, I think Mark Andreessen's sort of fund structuring is quite unique, as I see it. So I think people often underestimate. I think he constructs the future in a quite a literal way, which is that his fund structuring is to invest to learn about the future, and then follow on invest to create that future. So Absolutely. It's actually very much a learning oriented model, right? And he prizes, as far as I understand, a model where effectively, if a founder fails, actually the failure is not a failure. It's the price of discovery at the whole fund structuring level. So are you structuring a kind of a learning failure model built into your pricing, so that actually you expect 50% or 100% failure or 60% failure in the first half of the fund, and then you're going for a higher return in the later half? Like, are you looking at those structures?
Precisely. We're actually trying to figure out, are there mechanisms and innovations that we can do so that if and when companies do fail, that in subsequent ventures that the founders do, because we're betting on them as humans, especially at the very beginning, that we're able to follow on in their next ventures, whatever those may be. And it could be a second fund. Something also that we're looking at is the solidarity aspect. And it's not to say when a private wealth manager comes knocking at your door after you've exited, congratulations for the hard work that you've done, and the system has rewarded you for that. But when those bankers do come at your door, can we have now something in place that says, actually 30%, let's say, of my earnings, my hard work is actually going to a future Masawa or whatever entity, it doesn't matter that it's ours, liquidity fund, so that we can kind of circulate and create solidarity amongst all of the funders. Those are some other elements that we're...
a pooling model, pooled equity across the for all the founders or the kind of operators.
Yeah, a shared of the actually yes, and so that's what we're looking at. Is it possible for everyone to have part of the performance fee, the carry, so that we are a bit more bound together and it's not this competitive nature. And those are some of the things that we want to be able to pilot in this first fund, expand. If we look at what's happening in decentralized autonomous organizations, whether it be blockchain or not, there's also a lot of additionality that we can build to get us away from this one, like that the entire portfolio is riding on the success of one company. As an impact fund, that doesn't actually get us to the numbers of lives changed that we need to see.
And suppose coming to you, Caitlin, like a venture kind of investment model like that has a huge amount of outcome capability. So I wondered how a philanthropic organization could come in on the back end of that and actually all pre-buy outcomes in a way at a societal level, and thereby create a revenue stream for the venture. Is there a new way for philanthropy to loop in and partner in this way?
Yeah, well, that directly folds into the comment I was going to have on what Joshua was sharing, which is I think a lot of this comes down to a matter of de-risking. I know that Indy, you on the real estate side have been looking at, if you can actually limit the risk of downside, then you can offer, a lower upside return and have people sort of buy into that. Likewise, I see kind of folding in public and philanthropic capital as a way of de-risking that investment capital. And I want to actually add in a few additional layers of de-risking that I'm hearing here, which is if you're pricing the intangibles, right? You're starting to, we're all talking about different ways that we're reducing uncertainty. If you increase sort of transparency, if you increase sort of collaboration and sort of cohorting and education, these are all ways of kind of lowering risk of while also, there are other vectors of uncertainty that we're bringing in here as well, because we do want to encourage those mistakes. But I just kind of wanted to raise that sort of risk dimension. Another dimension that we've been looking at is, as we view this through a truly multi-capital lens, I think that, financial capital is one of many stakeholders. And so if we start to kind of even that circle, then some people are bringing capital, some people are bringing kind of skills, knowledge. There are all these other forms of resources that we're bringing to the table. And if we start just sort of shifting to view that a little bit differently, then I think we can have some really valuable insights there as then we move towards governing differently. And so I would also say that more participatory, more liquid forms of governance are a key component of this paradigm that I think we're all touching into. And then to more directly answer your question, Indy, again, this is where we get into, like, there comes a point where philanthropy feels very semantic, because if you're getting down to the point of measuring the returns for whether it's a philanthropic donation or whether it's an investment, ultimately what you want to be measuring on the project level is the same thing. Like the same, and that's something that we've been running into, is it almost starts, once you get really granular, it starts to feel almost absurdist, because you're saying, well, how do we want to package this? Are we packaging this as a report to a philanthropist to show, this is, or are we packaging it up and calling it a digital security and then selling it over here? It's the same measurement. And can we double count that? So we're actually starting to get into some really practical almost frustrations around that, because I think we're running head on into some of the absurdity of these binaries.
But it's really important. I suppose what I was quite enjoying in that conversation was, if you can marry the enlightened and care-centric venture capital model with effectively, say, a collective outcome buying capacity in some fashion, and you were to do that in a geography, you would not only create the new organizations and value creators of the forward, you would also be able to drive integrated effects and outcomes at a population level. So I'm increasingly interested in how these kind of ecosystem structures come together, because I think they're going to be critical to allow for, because it's not about centralized innovation. We need decentralized innovation. And we also need new ways of collectively looking at population level liabilities and all the stuff that you've been doing by reframing philanthropy itself. Because when these two things come together, we create really powerful ecosystems, which I think it would be really significant. I'm just conscious of time, and also, but maybe just give the last word to you, Joshua and Caitlin, and then we can wrap up. Maybe, Joshua, any thoughts from your side?
Yeah, I think this last area that we're looking at is something that's really very exciting. For me personally, having worked across various different capital buckets and seeing that those buckets are really, at the end of the day, they're insignificant, and using the different incentives and mechanisms, whether it be having a philanthropist contribute to a fund like ours, if depending on outcomes in year 3 and 5, they're able to give an additional top up of 20% of their portfolio for follow-on, which is where we're going to make the most impact, both financially and socially. And those types of mechanisms, which I haven't seen before. Hopefully they'll be coming out, but how do we kind of not just structure them, but also actively have what I call a process historian alongside as a contemporaneous anthropologist, being able to say, well, what was really happening when these discussions were going on, when the decisions were being made, and as not just looking at this one example that I gave, but all of these different new ways or ways that we're repackaging or evolving, so that we have a better understanding of really what the inputs are and kind of the feelings and emotions are needed happening in the discussions in the rooms. I think that's something I'd love to be able to see, work on, etc. So I think this is a great conversation to continue going forward. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I would say that the outcome buying doesn't have to be just through the investment side, but
Sure.
can be through the revenue side,
Oh,
which
most certainly.
also means it's a precursor for public and quasi-public agents to start to understand that the work that your startups and organizations are doing are mitigating their liabilities in new ways. So I think there's a really interesting ecosystem response. Caitlin, you have the last word, my dear friend.
I think part of what we're all building here is a new circulatory system in a way, right? We're looking for ways to transmit, whether it is financial capital, whether it's knowledge, whether it's measurement. I think we're all kind of seeking to prototype this model where we have enough complexity and enough sort of diversification of our prototypes that we can learn from them, but we always need for that information to make its way kind of back to the center to kind of sense make and pulse back out to apply again. And I think if we can find a way at the smallest scale to decide around shared language, I think this does come down to kind of language and metadata. If we can come to a set of shared agreements around those inputs, and then we can go out and scale and deploy, but always ensure we have the mechanisms in place for that learning to come back to the center. I think that's what's required for us to reach the type of scale that we're talking about here.
Yeah, couldn't have said it better myself. My friends, on behalf of Alistair, I don't look as good as him, but I would say thank you for your patience. Thank you for kind of working with the disruption itself. But I think it was kind of, we got to a meaningful moment as a result of that, I think, and a meaningful kind of idea of what constellations of capital are required and circulations of capital are required to make kind of a real deep dent in the kind of context that we're living in. So thank you, Joshua. Thank you, Caitlin. And on behalf of Alistair, thank you.
Thank you, Andy.
Cheers, friends.
Thank you.
Best travels.
I think I'm just going to leave.
Until we see each other soon. All right. Bye, everyone.
Cheers.
Bye.